The cold autumn wind swept through the canyon, rustling the dead leaves that clung to the cottonwood trees as Grace Valentino clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders. She hadn't expected the journey back to Nogales to be easy, but she certainly hadn't anticipated the dilapidated state of the rickety wooden bridge that spanned the gorge before her. But home was on the other side, and after 2 years away, nothing would keep her from it now. The year was 1885, and Nogales, Arizona Territory, was still a rough-edged settlement, a town where Mexico and America bled into one another like watercolors on a sun-baked canvas. Grace had left as a girl of 18, sent east to Philadelphia to be properly finished by her aunt after her mother's passing. Now at 20, she returned a woman, though perhaps not the refined society lady her aunt had hoped to create. Grace eyed the bridge warily. Wooden planks stretched across a 30-foot drop to the shallow, rock-strewn river below. Several boards were visibly rotted, and the supporting ropes had frayed in places, but it was the only crossing for miles. Her coach driver had refused to take the carriage across, setting her down with her 2 trunks at the edge. "I cannot wait for another day, sir," she had insisted when he'd suggested they find alternate lodging and attempt a different route tomorrow. "My father is expecting me." Now, standing alone at the edge of the gorge with her smaller valise in hand, the trunks would have to wait. She questioned her stubbornness. The wind picked up again, causing the bridge to sway gently. Grace took a deep breath. She had survived finishing school and Philadelphia society. She would not be defeated by a mere bridge. One careful step at a time, she began her crossing. The wooden slats creaked beneath her boots. She focused on the other side, refusing to look down at the water rushing below. Halfway across, she heard an ominous crack. Before she could react, the plank beneath her foot splintered, and the entire section of bridge gave way. Grace screamed as she felt herself falling, her hands desperately reaching for anything to hold on to. In that moment, time seemed to stretch like pulled taffy. She saw the frayed ropes snapping, the planks tumbling away beneath her, the rocky riverbed rushing up to meet her. This was how it would end, not by illness like her mother or by outlaws like so many in this territory, but by a foolish insistence on crossing a bridge that had clearly outlived its usefulness. But then, impossibly, her descent stopped. A strong arm had caught her around the waist, and she found herself pressed against a solid wall of muscle and the rough fabric of a duster coat. Grace looked up into the face of a man she'd never seen before, sun-bronzed skin, eyes the color of a summer storm, and a determined set to his jaw as he held her suspended over the gorge with one arm while his other hand gripped what remained of the bridge's support rope. "Hold tight, madam," the stranger said, his voice a low rumble. "I've got you." Grace did as she was told, wrapping her arms around the man's neck. He smelled of leather, horses, and the particular dust that seemed unique to the Arizona Territory. With a grunt of effort, he swung them both toward the rocky cliff face. "When I count to 3, I'm going to need you to help push off with your feet. We're going to swing to that ledge." He nodded toward a small outcropping about 6 feet away. "Ready." Grace nodded, her heart pounding like a blacksmith's hammer. 1, 2, 3, they swung through the air, and Grace pushed off with her feet as instructed. For a terrifying moment, they were suspended in nothingness, and then they landed on the narrow ledge, the man taking the brunt of the impact, his body cushioning hers against the rock face. "Thank you," Grace gasped, still clinging to him. "You saved my life." "Hadn't planned on cliff diving today," he replied with a slight smile that transformed his rugged face. "Name's Hank Blackwell, madam. Let's get you to safer ground before we make proper introductions." With careful maneuvering, Hank guided her up a narrow path along the cliff that eventually led them back to the canyon's edge. Only when they were standing on solid ground did Grace realize she was trembling from head to toe. "You're safe now," Hank assured her, keeping a steadying hand on her elbow. "Though I can't say the same for your bridge." Grace turned to look. Where the bridge had stood was now nothing but a few dangling ropes and splintered wood. Her valise was nowhere to be seen, likely at the bottom of the gorge. "My father will be beside himself," she murmured. That bridge was the main crossing for Nogales. She stopped, suddenly feeling lightheaded. The reality of what had nearly happened crashed over her like a wave. "I nearly died." "But you didn't," Hank said firmly. "Lucky I was passing through. Saw you from the ridge up yonder and thought that bridge didn't look fit to hold a jackrabbit, let alone a lady." Now that they were safely on solid ground, Grace took a moment to properly observe her rescuer. Hank Blackwell stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of a man who worked hard for his living. His dark hair curled slightly beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and his jaw was shadowed with stubble. He wore the practical clothing of a cowhand-worn denim trousers, a faded blue shirt, leather chaps, and a dust-covered duster. A gun belt hung low on his hips. "I'm Grace Valentino," she said, remembering her manners at last. "I was returning home to Nogales after 2 years in Philadelphia." "Valentino." Hank's expression changed slightly. "Any relation to Francisco Valentino?" "He's my father," Grace confirmed. Something flickered in Hank's eyes, but it was gone before she could identify it. "Then I reckon we'd better get you home, Miss Valentino. Your father must be expecting you." "He is, though I'm already later than planned. My trunks," she gestured helplessly toward the other side of the canyon where her luggage sat abandoned. "We'll come back for them," Hank assured her. "My horse is tied up just over that rise. I can take you into town." As they walked toward his horse, Grace tried to regain her composure. "What brings you to this area, Mr. Blackwell? I don't recall my father mentioning your name, and I thought I knew most of the ranchers in the territory." "Just passing through," he replied, his tone neutral. "Been working cattle drives up north. Thought I'd head south for the winter." They crested the small hill, and Grace saw a magnificent Palomino stallion grazing nearby, saddled and ready. "This is Thunder," Hank said, patting the horse's neck. "He's not much for manners, but he's fast and sure-footed." The horse nickered softly as Hank approached, then eyed Grace with what seemed like suspicion. "It's all right," Grace told the horse, extending her hand palm up. "I'm not planning to fall off any more bridges today." Hank's laugh was unexpected, a rich, warm sound that made Grace smile despite the harrowing experience she'd just survived. "Here, let me help you up," he said, interlacing his fingers to create a step for her foot. With surprising ease, he boosted her into the saddle. Before she could settle herself, Hank swung up behind her, his chest warm against her back as he reached around her to take the reins. Grace stiffened slightly at the unexpected proximity. "Apologies for the familiarity," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "But it'll be faster if we ride double, and that storm on the horizon isn't going to wait on propriety." Grace looked where he indicated and saw dark clouds building to the west. "Of course," she agreed, trying to ignore the strange fluttering in her stomach at his nearness. "My father will be worried enough without me being caught in a downpour." Hank clicked his tongue, and Thunder started forward at an easy lope. The motion forced Grace to lean back against Hank's solid chest, and after a few moments of awkward rigidity, she allowed herself to relax into the rhythm of the horse's movement. "So, Philadelphia," Hank said as they rode, "must be quite different from Nogales." "Like another world," Grace admitted. "My aunt insisted I needed refinement after Mother died. She taught me to paint watercolors, play the pianoforte, and speak without this accent." She let her natural southwestern drawl return to her speech. Hank chuckled. "And did you learn to be a proper Eastern lady?" "I learned to pretend," Grace replied honestly. "But I missed home every day, the open skies, the mountains, even the dust. Philadelphia has too many buildings, too many people, and not enough horizon. I know what you mean, Hank said. Spent some time in Chicago once. Felt like the buildings were closing in on me. Give me open country any day. As they rode, the landscape began to look more familiar to Grace. The distinctive silhouette of the Patagonia Mountains rose in the distance, and the vegetation changed from sparse desert scrub to the mixture of cottonwoods, mesquites, and cacti that characterized the land around Nogales. We should reach town before the storm hits, Hank said, glancing at the darkening sky. My father's ranch is just outside town, Grace told him. The Broken V. I know it, Hank interrupted, then added more softly. Everyone knows the Broken V. There was something in his tone that made Grace curious, but before she could question him, thunder suddenly reared, nearly unseating them both. Hank's arm tightened around Grace's waist, keeping her secure as he brought the horse under control. Rattler, he explained, pointing to a large diamondback slithering across their path. Thunder hates snakes. Don't we all? Grace murmured, her heart racing again. This day seems determined to test my nerves. You're handling it better than most would, Hank observed, guiding Thunder around the snake's path. Most Eastern ladies I've met would have fainted dead away by now. I wasn't always an Eastern lady, Grace reminded him. I grew up here. This land is in my blood, even if my aunt did try to scrub it out. They continued riding, the first fat raindrops beginning to fall as the outskirts of Nogales came into view. The town had grown in her absence, with several new buildings lining the main street. Grace felt a surge of emotion at seeing her hometown again. Welcome back to Nogales, Hank said quietly. They rode through the main street, drawing curious glances from townsfolk hurrying to escape the coming rain. Grace recognized many faces, though few seemed to recognize her in return. She supposed 2 years, and her aunt's refinements had changed her appearance more than she realized. They continued through town and took the familiar road that led to the Broken V Ranch. As they approached the main house, a sprawling adobe structure with a wide veranda, Grace felt tears prick her eyes. Home. She was finally home. A figure appeared on the porch, and even at a distance, Grace recognized her father. Francisco Valentino had the same proud bearing she remembered, though his hair seemed to have more silver than when she'd left. Papa, she called out, unable to contain herself. Hank brought Thunder to a halt at the hitching post, and before he could help her down, Grace had already slid from the saddle and was running toward the porch. Her father met her halfway, enfolding her in an embrace that smelled of tobacco, leather, and home. Gracie, he said, his voice thick with emotion. My little Gracie. I'm home, Papa, she said, blinking back tears. I've missed you so much. Francisco Valentino held his daughter at arm's length, examining her with pride. Look at you, a proper lady now, eh? Your mother would be so proud. The bridge collapsed, Papa, Grace said suddenly, remembering. The old canyon bridge, it fell while I was crossing. I would have been killed if not for Mr. Blackwell. For the first time, her father seemed to notice Hank, who stood respectfully by his horse, rain beginning to darken his duster. Blackwell. Francisco's expression changed, hardening into something Grace couldn't quite interpret. Hank Blackwell. Hank removed his hat, revealing the full extent of his handsome features as he met Francisco's gaze. Mr. Valentino, he said with a nod. The tension between the two men was palpable, and Grace looked from one to the other in confusion. You know each other? She asked. We've met, her father replied tersely. Then, visibly composing himself, he added, It seems I owe you a debt, Mr. Blackwell, for saving my daughter's life. No debt, sir, Hank replied. Anyone would have done the same. But it wasn't anyone, it was you. Francisco's voice held a strange note. Please come inside out of this rain. Maria will prepare a room for you. That's not necessary, Hank began. I insist, Francisco cut him off. No man who saves a Valentino will be turned away from our door. Besides, that storm is only going to get worse. As if to punctuate his words, thunder rumbled overhead and the rain began to fall in earnest. My trunks, Grace remembered. They're still at the canyon's edge. I'll send men for them immediately, her father assured her. Thank you, Mr. Blackwell, Grace said as they climbed the steps to the porch. I don't know how to repay you. Call me Hank, he replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. And staying alive is payment enough, Miss Valentino. As they entered the house, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to the story between Hank Blackwell and her father than either man was telling. But for now, she was home, she was safe, and she was overwhelmingly grateful to the cowboy who had plucked her from certain death. The Broken V Ranch house was exactly as Grace remembered: warm adobe walls, heavy wooden beams overhead, and her mother's careful touches still evident in the colorful woven blankets and pottery that decorated the large main room. The scent of roasting meat and fresh bread filled the air, making her stomach remind her that it had been many hours since she'd eaten. Maria, her father called, prepare another place for dinner, and make up the blue room for our guest. The plump Mexican woman who had been the ranch's housekeeper for as long as Grace could remember appeared from the kitchen, her face lighting up at the sight of Grace. Mija, you have returned. Maria rushed forward, enveloping Grace in a flowery embrace. Look how beautiful you are. Like your mother, may she rest in peace. I've missed you, Maria, Grace said, returning the hug, and your cooking. No one in Philadelphia could make tortillas like yours. Of course not, Maria said with a sniff. Those gringos in the East know nothing of real food. She turned her attention to Hank, eyeing him with open curiosity. And who is this? This is Mr. Blackwell, Francisco said. He saved Grace's life today when the canyon bridge collapsed. He'll be our guest tonight. Maria's eyes widened. Blackwell, she crossed herself quickly. Dios mío. Before anyone could respond to her strange reaction, Maria hurried back to the kitchen, muttering in Spanish. Please sit. Francisco gestured to the large leather chairs near the fireplace. I'll have Miguel bring some whiskey to warm us. Hank hesitated. If you don't mind, Mr. Valentino, I'd like to see to my horse first. Of course, Francisco nodded. Miguel can show you to the stables. As if summoned by his name, a young Mexican ranch hand appeared. Francisco gave him instructions in rapid Spanish, and the young man nodded, gesturing for Hank to follow him. I'll return shortly, Hank said with a brief nod to Grace. Once Hank had left, Grace turned to her father. Papa, what's going on? Everyone's acting strange about Mr. Blackwell. Do you know him? Francisco sighed, suddenly looking older. It's complicated, Gracie. I'm not a child anymore, Grace reminded him. Whatever it is, I can handle it. Her father poured himself a generous measure of whiskey from the decanter on the side table. The Blackwells and the Valentinos have history. What kind of history? Francisco took a long drink before answering. His father, Jedediah Blackwell, and I were once partners. We came to Arizona Territory together back in '58. We staked adjoining claims, built our ranches side by side. For years, we were like brothers. What happened? Grace asked, sensing the story took a dark turn. There was a dispute over water rights during a drought about 12 years ago. Things were said, accusations made. It got ugly. In the end, Jedediah was killed. Grace gasped. Killed by whom? Francisco's expression grew guarded. Some say it was one of our ranch hands. The matter was never settled officially. You mean he was murdered and no one was held accountable? Grace was shocked. Those were different times, Gracie, before the territory had proper law. Francisco stared into his glass. After that, the Blackwell Ranch fell into disrepair. Hank was just a boy then, no more than 15. He left these parts soon after. And now he's back, Grace murmured, and he saved my life. Yes, Francisco said heavily. And that puts me in a difficult position. Before Grace could ask what he meant, the door opened and Hank returned, shaking rainwater from his hat. The storm had intensified, wind now driving the rain sideways against the windows. "Your stable boy knows his business," Hank commented. Thunders settled nicely. "Miguel's been with us for years," Francisco acknowledged. "Please join us by the fire. You must be chilled to the bone." As Hank took a seat across from them, Maria entered with a tray of steaming mugs. "Hot chocolate," she announced. "Like your mother used to make, Mija. Dinner will be ready soon." Grace accepted the mug gratefully, watching as Hank did the same. When his fingers brushed Maria's, the older woman didn't flinch, but Grace noticed she avoided meeting his eyes. "Thank you," Hank said politely. Maria nodded and retreated to the kitchen. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the drumming of rain on the roof. "Mr. Blackwell," Francisco finally said, "may I ask what brings you back to Nogales after all this time?" Hank took a sip of his chocolate before answering. "I've been working ranches up north, saved enough to buy back my father's land." Francisco's knuckles whitened around his glass. "The old Blackwell place has been abandoned for years." "I know," Hank said evenly, "but it's still mine by right. The deed's in my saddlebag. You plan to rebuild." Francisco's tone was carefully neutral, but Grace sensed the tension beneath. "I do," Hank confirmed. "It's time to come home." The implications hung in the air. Hank Blackwell would be their neighbor, rebuilding on land adjoining the Broken V land that had been the source of a deadly dispute. "Well," Francisco said after a moment, "Arizona Territory is a free country. A man has the right to work his own land." He raised his glass slightly. "And I suppose I should welcome the return of a man who saved my daughter's life." Hank inclined his head in acknowledgement, but said nothing. Grace, sensing the need to ease the tension, changed the subject. "Mr. Blackwell, Hank, you must tell us about your travels." "I've never been further north than Tucson." Hank's expression softened as he looked at her. "Not much to tell that would interest a lady like yourself, Miss Valentino. Please call me Grace," she insisted. "And I assure you, I find the real West far more interesting than the penny dreadfuls my Philadelphia friends used to smuggle into the seminary." A genuine smile tugged at Hank's lips. "Well, I've driven cattle from Texas to Montana, worked mines in Colorado, and spent a winter with the Cheyenne up near the Black Hills." As Hank began to relate his adventures, Grace found herself captivated. He spoke plainly, but painted vivid pictures of places she'd only read about: the endless grassy plains of the Dakota Territory, the towering mountains of Colorado, the sprawling cattle ranches of Texas. His voice was low and measured, but his eyes came alive when he described the beauty of the untamed wilderness. Francisco listened too, occasionally asking a question about cattle prices or grazing conditions, professional concerns that suggested he was setting aside personal history for the moment. When Maria announced that dinner was ready, they moved to the large oak table in the dining room. The meal was everything Grace had missed during her time in Philadelphia: tender beef slow-cooked with chilies, fresh tortillas, beans seasoned with epazote, and Maria's famous flan for dessert. As they ate, Grace observed Hank more carefully. Despite his rough exterior, he handled himself with surprising grace, using the correct fork without hesitation and waiting for her to begin eating before starting himself. She wondered where a cowboy had learned such manners. The conversation during dinner remained carefully polite, focusing on safe topics like the weather, the condition of the roads, and changes to the town of Nogales. When the meal was finished, Francisco rose. "If you'll excuse me, I need to check with the foreman about retrieving Grace's trunks tomorrow, assuming the storm passes. Grace, perhaps you could show Mr. Blackwell to the library. I'll join you shortly for brandy." Grace nodded, understanding her father's need for a moment alone. The day's events had clearly unsettled him. Between her unexpected arrival, her near-death experience, and the reappearance of Hank Blackwell. "This way," she said, leading Hank down a short hallway to her father's library, a small room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk. Once they were alone, Hank's demeanor changed subtly. He seemed to relax, as if relieved to be away from Francisco's watchful gaze. "Your father has a fine home," he observed, examining the books on the nearest shelf. "I remember it being impressive when I was a boy, but it's grown even more so." "The broken V has prospered," Grace acknowledged, "though I didn't realize until today that it came at such a cost." Hank turned to look at her, his expression guarded. "What did your father tell you about me? That your father and he were once partners? That there was a dispute over water rights and your father was killed? That some blamed one of our ranch hands?" Grace met his gaze directly. "Is that why you've returned? For revenge?" Hank's eyes darkened. "I've returned for justice, Miss Valentino, but not in the way you might think." "Explain, then," Grace challenged him. He approached slowly, stopping just close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "I've spent 12 years working, saving, learning. I could have come back with guns blazing, looking to settle old scores. Many expected me to." "Why didn't you?" "Because that's not justice," Hank said quietly. "That's just more bloodshed. I want the truth, and I want what's rightfully mine. My father's land, his good name. And once you have those things," Grace pressed, "then I can finally stop running." Something vulnerable flickered across his face. "Maybe find some peace." Grace felt a swell of compassion for this man who had saved her life. Whatever the history between their families, he had acted with honor today. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said sincerely. "And I'm grateful that your quest brought you to that canyon today." Hank's expression softened. "So am I." The moment between them stretched, laden with something Grace couldn't quite name. Then the door opened and Francisco entered, breaking the tension. "Maria has prepared your room, Mr. Blackwell," he announced. "I'm sure you must be tired after today's excitement." "Thank you for your hospitality," Hank replied, stepping away from Grace. "I am a bit worn out." "Miguel will show you to your room," Francisco said. The young ranch hand appeared in the doorway as if on cue. "Good night, Mr. Blackwell," Grace said. "And thank you again." Hank nodded to her, then to Francisco, before following Miguel from the room. When they were alone, Francisco poured himself another whiskey. "You should get some rest too, Gracie. It's been a long day for you as well." "Papa," Grace said, not ready to retire, "I need to know more about what happened with the Blackwells. If Hank is going to be our neighbor, that's for another time." Francisco cut her off gently but firmly. "Tonight, I just want to thank God you're home safe." Grace recognized the tone. Her father had closed the subject for now. With a sigh, she kissed his cheek. "Good night, Papa. It's good to be home." As she climbed the familiar stairs to her old bedroom, Grace's mind whirled with questions. About the bridge collapse, about Hank Blackwell, about the tension that filled the house at his presence. But most of all about the strange fluttering in her chest whenever those storm-gray eyes met hers. The night brought no answers, only dreams of falling and strong arms catching her before she could shatter on the rocks below. Morning arrived with brilliant sunshine, the storm having cleared during the night, leaving the world washed clean. Grace woke early, eager to reacquaint herself with the ranch. She dressed in a simple blue calico dress far less fussy than the fashionable gowns her aunt had insisted upon in Philadelphia, and made her way downstairs. The house was already awake, with Maria bustling about the kitchen preparing breakfast. The aroma of coffee, chorizo, and fresh tortillas filled the air. "Buenos dias, Mija," Maria greeted her. "You still rise with the sun, I see. Some things do not change, even with fancy Eastern schooling." Grace laughed, accepting the mug of coffee Maria offered. Some habits are too deeply ingrained. Is Papa up? He left at dawn with the men to retrieve your trunks, Maria informed her, and to examine what remains of the bridge. He was very concerned. And Mr. Blackwell? Grace tried to make the question sound casual. Maria's knowing look suggested she wasn't fooled. He is in the stable, seeing to his horse. That one rises even earlier than you. Grace sipped her coffee, trying to ignore the flutter of anticipation at knowing Hank was still on the property. I think I'll go for a walk before breakfast, reacquaint myself with the place. Of course, Maria nodded, but do not go far. Your father would worry. Grace promised she wouldn't, then slipped outside into the crisp morning air. The ranch spread out before her, bathed in golden early light. The main house sat on a gentle rise, providing a view of the surrounding property pastures where cattle grazed, the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived, corrals, stables, and beyond, the rolling hills that marked the boundaries of Broken V land. Almost without conscious decision, her feet took her toward the stables. She told herself she merely wanted to see if any of her father's horses were still around from when she'd left, particularly her own mare, Estrella. The stable doors were open, and as Grace approached, she heard low murmuring from within. She paused at the entrance, seeing Hank brushing down Thunder while speaking softly to the Palomino. "Can't stay long," she caught him saying to the horse. "Just long enough to make arrangements in town, then we'll head out to the old place." The horse nickered as if in response. "I know," Hank continued. "It complicates things, but I couldn't let her fall, could I?" Grace realized with a start that Hank was talking about her. She cleared her throat, announcing her presence before she could hear anything else not meant for her ears. Hank turned, surprise momentarily registering on his face before his features settled into a polite smile. "Good morning, Miss Valentino." "Grace," she corrected him. "I thought we'd established that yesterday." "Grace," he amended, his smile warming slightly. "You're up early." "I could say the same of you." She approached, stopping a respectful distance from Thunder, who eyed her suspiciously. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the horse. Hank nodded. "Careful, though. He's particular about who touches him." Grace extended her hand slowly, letting Thunder catch her scent. After a moment, the horse stretched out his neck, allowing her to stroke his nose. "Well, I'll be," Hank said, sounding impressed. "He doesn't take to most people." "I've always had a way with horses," Grace replied. "My father says I got it from my mother. She was half Mexican from a family of vaqueros." "That explains a lot," Hank murmured, "such as your comfort in the saddle yesterday. And why you came back to Nogales instead of staying in Philadelphia with all its comforts and high society." Grace smiled, pleased that he had understood. Philadelphia has its charms, but it never felt like home. The buildings are too tall, the streets too narrow, the air too thick with smoke. "And the people?" Hank asked, returning to his brushing of Thunder's flank. "Too concerned with appearances and positions," Grace admitted. "Everything is rules and expectations. Who visits whom, what to wear for morning calls versus evening socials, how many dances it's proper to share with a gentleman." Hank chuckled. "Sounds exhausting." "It was," Grace agreed. "Though I did learn useful things. Languages, literature, music." "A proper lady's education," Hank observed. "Yes. My aunt was determined I shouldn't become a wild frontier woman like my mother." Grace stroked Thunder's neck, remembering. "But my mother was wonderful. She could ride like the wind, shoot straight as any man, and still be the most graceful person at any gathering." "She sounds remarkable," Hank said softly. "I remember her a little from when I was young. She was kind to me once when I fell from my horse near your property, bandaged my knee and gave me lemonade before sending me home." "That sounds like her." Grace smiled at the memory. She believed in kindness above all else. Even to Blackwells, apparently, despite whatever disputes were brewing. Hank set down his brush, his expression growing serious. "Grace, about yesterday your father may have given you the impression that there you are." Francisco's voice interrupted from the stable doorway. "The men and I just returned with your trunks, Gracie. Everything's safe, though that valise of yours is at the bottom of the gorge, I'm afraid." "Nothing irreplaceable in it, Papa," Grace assured him, stepping away from Thunder. "Just some books and toiletries." Francisco nodded, his gaze moving between his daughter and Hank with poorly concealed suspicion. "Mr. Blackwell, I must thank you again for what you did yesterday. The remains of that bridge show it was far more deteriorated than anyone realized." "If you hadn't been there—" He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "As I said, sir, anyone would have done the same," Hank replied. "Perhaps, but it was you who did it." Francisco seemed to come to a decision. "I'd like to offer you a proposition. The bridge will need to be rebuilt. It's vital for commerce between Nogales and the eastern settlements. I'm planning to fund most of the construction myself, and I could use someone with strong arms and good sense to oversee the project. The pay would be fair, and it would give you time to assess your plans for the old Blackwell place." Grace looked at her father in surprise. This was an olive branch she hadn't expected. Hank seemed equally taken aback. "That's generous, Mr. Valentino, but I'm not sure it's wise given our history." "Perhaps it's time to put history behind us," Francisco suggested. "At least long enough to rebuild a bridge." Hank was silent for a long moment, considering. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I accept, but I'll need a couple of days to make arrangements in town and survey my father's property first." "Of course," Francisco agreed. "Take the time you need. The bridge project won't start until next week at the earliest. Materials need to be ordered." He turned to Grace. "Maria has breakfast ready, shall we?" As they walked back to the house, Grace felt a curious mixture of emotions. Relief that her father seemed willing to set aside old grudges, excitement at the prospect of Hank staying in the area longer, and unease at the undercurrents she still sensed beneath the civility. Breakfast was a lively affair, with Francisco questioning Grace about her time in Philadelphia and sharing news of Nogales and the ranch. Hank contributed occasionally to the conversation, but remained largely an observer. After the meal, he announced his intention to ride into town. "I need to register my deed at the land office and make some purchases," he explained. "Of course," Francisco nodded. "I'll have Miguel prepare a list of what we'll need for the bridge project. Perhaps you could inquire about lumber prices while you're there." "Happy to," Hank agreed. "May I accompany Mr. Blackwell, Papa?" Grace asked suddenly. "I'd like to see how the town has changed and to purchase some things to replace what was lost in my valise." Francisco frowned slightly. "It's not proper for you to travel alone with a gentleman, Gracie." "Maria could accompany us as chaperone," Grace suggested, not ready to be confined to the ranch so soon after her return. "Please, Papa, I've been away for 2 years. After a moment's consideration, Francisco relented. "Very well, but be back before sunset and stay with Maria at all times." Within the hour, they were ready to depart. Grace wore a simple riding habit, and Maria, looking distinctly uncomfortable about the whole arrangement, was perched on a gentle mare. Hank, mounted on Thunder, led the way down the road toward Nogales. The ride into town was pleasant, with Grace pointing out landmarks to Hank and explaining how things had changed since he'd last been in the area. Maria maintained a watchful silence, her eyes never leaving the pair. Nogales had indeed grown in the 2 years of Grace's absence. The town now boasted a proper hotel, a bank, several new stores, and even a small theater. The arrival of the railroad 2 years prior had brought prosperity and new settlers. Their first stop was the land office, where Hank presented his deed to a clerk who examined it with raised eyebrows. "The old Blackwell place," the man said, adjusting his spectacles. "That land hasn't been worked in years, Thought it had been abandoned for good. Not abandoned, Hank corrected firmly. Just waiting for its rightful owner to return. The clerk shrugged and recorded the transaction, making Hank's ownership official. As they left the office, Grace noticed several townspeople watching them with undisguised curiosity. A few older residents whispered behind their hands at the sight of a Valentino and a Blackwell walking side by side. People have long memories here, Grace observed quietly. Small towns always do, Hank replied. They visited the general store next, where Grace purchased replacement toiletries and some writing paper, while Hank inquired about lumber prices and building supplies. The storekeeper, Mr. Jenkins, was clearly surprised to see Hank. Blackwell's boy, all grown up, he marveled. Never thought you'd come back to these parts. Some ties can't be broken, Mr. Jenkins, Hank replied evenly, even by time or distance. Their next stop was the telegraph office, where Grace sent a message to her aunt in Philadelphia, confirming her safe arrival, though she omitted the harrowing details of the bridge collapse. As they walked toward the hotel restaurant for lunch, a broad-shouldered man with a sheriff's badge stepped into their path. "Thought that was you, Blackwell," the man said, his hand resting casually near his holster. "Word travels fast in a town like this." "Sheriff Davis," Hank greeted him with a nod. "You've moved up in the world since I left, and you've got nerve coming back," the sheriff replied. His gaze shifted to Grace and Maria. "Miss Valentino, welcome home. Your father know you're keeping this company." "My father is well aware of who I'm with, Sheriff," Grace replied coolly. "In fact, Mr. Blackwell saved my life yesterday when the Canyon Bridge collapsed, and he's agreed to help rebuild it." Sheriff Davis looked surprised. "Is that so? Well, good deeds don't erase history, miss." "Perhaps not," Grace countered, "but they can certainly help shape the future." The sheriff gave Hank a hard look. "I'll be watching you, Blackwell. Don't give me reason to question your intentions." "I'm just here to reclaim my father's land and help rebuild a bridge, Sheriff," Hank said calmly. "Nothing more." After a tense moment, the sheriff stepped aside, allowing them to pass. As they continued toward the hotel, Grace noticed Hank's jaw was clenched tight. "The sheriff seems to have strong opinions about you," she observed once they were out of earshot. "Davis was one of your father's ranch hands back when everything happened," Hank explained quietly. "He was there the day my father died." Grace absorbed this information in silence. The layers of history and connection ran deeper than she had realized. Lunch at the hotel restaurant was a quiet affair, with Maria maintaining her role as vigilant chaperone, her dark eyes missing nothing. Afterward, they completed their remaining errands, purchasing the supplies Hank would need for his initial work on the Blackwell property. Their final stop was to see about ordering lumber for the bridge project. The lumberyard owner promised to have a quote ready within days, and seemed pleased at the prospect of such a large order. As they prepared to return to the Broken V, dark clouds began gathering on the horizon. "Another storm coming," Hank observed, glancing at the sky. "We should head back while we can." They mounted their horses and set off, pushing a bit faster than their morning pace. The wind picked up as they rode, carrying the scent of rain. About halfway back to the ranch, fat raindrops began to fall. "There's an old line shack just ahead," Hank called over the rising wind. "We can wait out the worst of it there," Grace nodded, following as he led them off the main road onto a narrower trail. Within minutes, they reached a small wooden structure nestled among some scrub oak. It was weathered but solid, clearly maintained for just such emergencies. They dismounted quickly, leading the horses to a lean-to attached to the side of the shack. Inside, the cabin was spare but dry, with a small wood stove, a rough table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot. "Your father's men keep these stocked," Hank explained, finding matches and lighting the lamps. "There should be firewood and some basic provisions." Maria immediately took charge, checking the wood box and starting a small fire in the stove. "We will be comfortable enough until the storm passes," she declared. "Though your father will be worried, Mija." "He'll understand we couldn't ride through this," Grace said, moving to the small window to watch as the rain intensified, now coming down in sheets. Lightning flashed, followed closely by a crack of thunder that made her jump. "Looks like we might be here a while," Hank observed, removing his duster and hanging it on a peg by the door. "These summer storms can blow over quickly or settle in for hours." Maria gave him a sharp look. "I will prepare some coffee," she announced. "There are beans and a pot here." As Maria busied herself with the stove, Grace found herself standing awkwardly in the center of the small space, acutely aware of Hank's presence. The cabin suddenly seemed much smaller than it had a moment ago. "You should sit, Miss Valentino," Hank said, pulling out one of the chairs for her. "No sense in standing while we wait." Grace took the offered seat, and Hank settled into the other chair across the small table. Outside, the storm raged, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling around the eaves. "I apologize for the circumstances," Hank said after a moment. "I'm sure this isn't how you plan to spend your afternoon." "Being caught in a storm is hardly your fault," Grace replied with a small smile. "Besides, after surviving a bridge collapse yesterday, a little rain doesn't seem so terrible." Hank's expression grew serious. "About that bridge collapse, there's something you should know." Maria cleared her throat loudly from her position by the stove. "The coffee will be ready soon," she announced pointedly. Hank glanced at her, then back at Grace. "Perhaps another time," he said quietly. The silence that followed was broken only by the storm outside and the occasional clink of Maria's movements at the stove. Grace found herself studying Hank's face, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his right temple, the way his dark lashes framed those remarkable gray eyes. There was a gravity to him that spoke of hard experiences, yet something in those eyes hinted at kindness. "How did you get that scar?" she asked suddenly, wanting to break the silence. Hank's hand went to his temple, touching the mark absently. "Bar fight in Dodge City," he admitted. "First and last time I let myself get pulled into someone else's quarrel." "What happened?" "Two cowboys disagreed about a card game. I was just trying to get to the bar for a drink when a bottle came flying. Wrong place, wrong time." He shrugged. "Learned to keep my distance from other people's troubles after that." "Yet you didn't keep your distance when you saw me on that bridge," Grace observed. Hank's gaze met hers. "Some situations demand involvement, regardless of the risk." The intensity in his eyes made Grace's breath catch. Before she could respond, Maria appeared at the table with 3 steaming mugs. "Drink," she instructed. "It will warm you." The coffee was strong and black, reminding Grace of mornings on the ranch before she'd left for Philadelphia. As they sipped in silence, the worst of the storm began to pass, the thunder growing more distant and the rain easing to a steady patter. "We should be able to continue soon," Hank said, glancing out the window. "The road will be muddy but passable." Grace found herself strangely reluctant to leave the intimacy of the small cabin, but she nodded in agreement. "Papa will be wondering where we are." Within half an hour, the rain had subsided enough for them to venture out. The world smelled fresh and clean, the dust of the road transformed into slick mud. They mounted their horses and set off at a careful pace, mindful of the slippery conditions. They arrived at the broken V as the sun was breaking through the clouds, casting golden light across the wet landscape. Francisco was waiting on the porch, relief evident on his face as he watched them approach. "Thank God," he said as they dismounted. "I was about to send men looking for you." "We took shelter in the line shack when the storm hit, Papa," Grace explained. "We're perfectly fine." Francisco nodded, though his eyes lingered on Hank with an unreadable expression. "Come inside and dry off. Maria, prepare something warm for them to drink." As Maria headed to the kitchen, Francisco turned to Hank. "Mr. Blackwell, a word in private if you don't mind." "Of course," Hank agreed. "Gracie, go change into something dry," Francisco instructed. "I need to speak with Mr. Blackwell about the bridge project." Grace hesitated, curious about what her father really wanted to discuss, but the firm set of his jaw told her this was not a conversation she was invited to join. With a nod, she headed inside, casting one last glance at Hank, who stood straight-backed and expressionless beside her father. Upstairs, she changed into a fresh dress, her mind whirling with questions. What was her father saying to Hank? What had Hank been about to tell her in the lined shack before Maria interrupted? And why did she feel such a strong connection to a man she'd only just met? By the time she returned downstairs, Hank was preparing to leave. "Mr. Blackwell has business to attend to at his property," Francisco explained, his tone carefully neutral. "He'll return in a few days to begin work on the bridge project." "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough," Hank added. "It's time I assessed what needs to be done at my father's place." Grace felt a pang of disappointment. "Will you join us for dinner before you go?" "Another time, perhaps," Hank replied. "I want to reach my land before dark." There was a finality to his tone that suggested her father's private word had changed something. Grace followed them outside, where Miguel had already brought thunder around. "Thank you for your company today, Miss Valentino," Hank said formally as he mounted. "And for your hospitality, Mr. Valentino." "Safe journey, Mr. Blackwell," Francisco replied with equal formality. Grace stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwell, Hank, thank you again for saving my life. I hope we'll see you soon." Hank's expression softened slightly as he looked down at her. "You will," he promised. With a touch to his hat brim, he turned thunder and rode away, his figure gradually diminishing as he followed the road that led toward the eastern hills where the old Blackwell property lay. "What did you say to him, Papa?" Grace asked once he was out of sight. Francisco sighed. "I reminded him of certain realities, Gracie. The past doesn't disappear just because we wish it would." "What exactly happened with his father?" Grace pressed. "I deserve to know the truth." Her father was silent for a long moment. "Come inside," he finally said. "It's time you heard the whole story." Inside his study, Francisco poured himself a drink before settling into his chair. Grace sat across from him, waiting as he gathered his thoughts. "Jedediah Blackwell and I came to this territory as young men with big dreams," he began. "We staked neighboring claims, built our ranches side by side. For years, we were the best of friends. I was the best man at his wedding. He was godfather to your older brother before the fever took him." Grace nodded. Her brother Miguel had died as a toddler, years before she was born. "Things changed during the drought of '73, Francisco continued. "Water became precious. The creek that runs between our properties began to dry up. Jedediah accused me of damming it further upstream, diverting more than my share." "Did you?" Grace asked quietly. Francisco's eyes flashed. "I did what was necessary to save my cattle, but I never took more than was fair. Jedediah wouldn't listen to reason. He became obsessed with the idea that I was trying to ruin him. What happened the day he died? He came here, drunk and armed, threatening to blow up the small dam we'd built. There was a confrontation. Guns were drawn. Francisco took a long drink. In the chaos, Jedediah was shot. No one could say for certain whose bullet struck him. And Hank? Where was he? At the ranch house, I assume. He was 15, already working his father's land like a man. After Jedediah died, the boy just disappeared, rode out one night with nothing but his horse and whatever he could carry. The ranch fell into disrepair. We all assumed he'd never return. But now he has, Grace said softly. Yes, and I'm not sure why. Francisco looked troubled. He says he wants to reclaim his father's land, rebuild the ranch. But a man doesn't carry a grudge for 12 years only to return with peaceful intentions. He saved my life, Papa, Grace reminded him. Yes, and for that I'll always be grateful. But I can't help wondering if his appearance at that bridge was truly coincidence. Francisco leaned forward. Gracie, I want you to be careful around Hank Blackwell. Whatever he says, whatever he does, remember that he has reasons for being here that go beyond reclaiming a rundown ranch. Grace wanted to protest, to defend Hank, but she realized she had no grounds to do so. She barely knew him, after all. And yet, something in her heart rebelled against the idea that his heroic actions had been calculated or that his intentions were anything but honorable. I'll be careful, Papa, she promised, though in her mind, she was already forming her own plan to discover the truth about Hank Blackwell. The next few days passed slowly for Grace. She reacquainted herself with the ranch, rode her old mare Estrella across the familiar landscape, and caught up with the ranch hands and their families, many of whom she'd known since childhood. But her thoughts kept returning to Hank and the mystery surrounding his return. On the third day after his departure, Grace made a decision. After breakfast, she saddled Estrella and informed her father she was going for a morning ride. Stay on our property, Francisco cautioned, and be back by noon. Grace nodded, though she had no intention of obeying either instruction. As soon as she was out of sight of the main house, she turned Estrella toward the east, following the road that led to the old Blackwell ranch. It was a beautiful morning, with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and mesquite. After about an hour's ride, Grace came to a weather-beaten sign that marked the boundary of the Blackwell property. Beyond it, the trail wound through a landscape similar to the broken V rolling hills dotted with oak and juniper, good pastureland interspersed with rocky outcroppings. As she crested a hill, the Blackwell ranch house came into view in the valley below. It was smaller than the Valentino hacienda, built in the style of eastern farmhouses rather than the adobe construction common to the area. Years of neglect showed in the sagging porch and missing roof shingles, but Grace could see signs of recent activity. Fresh lumber was stacked near the house, and thunder grazed in a newly repaired corral. She hesitated, suddenly uncertain of her impulsiveness. What would she say to Hank? How would she explain her presence on his property? Before she could decide whether to continue or turn back, the decision was made for her. Didn't expect visitors so soon, Hank's voice came from behind her. Grace turned in the saddle to find him sitting atop a large boulder, a rifle resting casually across his knees. He'd clearly been watching her approach for some time. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, attempting to sound composed despite her embarrassment at being caught. "I was just exploring." "Pretty far from Broken V land for an exploration," he observed, standing and making his way down from the boulder. He wore no jacket today, just a blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing sun-bronzed forearms corded with muscle. "I wanted to see how your repairs were coming along," Grace admitted, abandoning her flimsy excuse. "And I had questions that my father seemed reluctant to answer fully." Hank approached Estrella, running a hand along the mare's neck. "Your father has his reasons for caution." "I can't fault him for that. Will you answer my questions?" Grace asked directly. Hank considered her for a long moment. "Why don't you come down to the house? I can offer coffee at least, though the accommodations aren't much yet." Grace nodded and followed as Hank led the way down the hill. Up close, the ranch house looked even more dilapidated, though she could see where Hank had begun making repairs, replacing rotted boards on the porch and patching holes in the roof. "It's a good house," Hank said, noting her appraisal. "Strong bones. My father built it to last." "It must be strange, being back after so long," Grace observed as she dismounted. "Like stepping into a dream," Hank agreed, "or maybe a nightmare, depending on the moment." He helped her secure Estrella next to Thunder, then led her to the porch. The front door opened into what had once been a comfortable sitting room. Now, it was mostly empty save for a table, 2 chairs, and a bedroll in the corner. Tools and building supplies were stacked along one wall. Hank moved to the small kitchen area, where a coffee pot sat on a recently cleaned wood stove. "It's not fancy, but it's hot," he said, pouring 2 cups. Grace accepted the offered mug and took a seat at the table. "You've been busy," she observed, looking around at the evidence of his work. "There's a lot to do if I want it habitable before winter," Hank replied, sitting across from her. "Now, what questions are so important they brought you riding out here alone against your father's wishes, I'd wager?" Grace took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "My father told me about the drought, the water dispute, and your father's death, but I feel like there's more to the story." "There always is," Hank said quietly. "Why did you really come back?" Grace asked directly. "After 12 years, why now?" Hank's gray eyes studied her face. "Do you know what it's like to have a question burning inside you for most of your life? To never know for certain what happened on the worst day of your existence?" Grace shook her head. "I left because I was a boy who couldn't face what happened. I stayed away because I was angry and afraid. I came back because I finally realized that, until I face the past, I'll never have a future." "You don't believe the official account of your father's death," Grace surmised. "I believe my father was killed," Hank said carefully. "I don't know by whom or exactly why, but I intend to find out." "And then what? Revenge?" Hank's expression hardened. "I want justice, Grace, and peace. 12 years is a long time to carry the weight of not knowing." "My father thinks you blame him," Grace said, "that you've returned with some plan to harm him or the ranch." "I don't know who's responsible," Hank replied. "It could have been your father, one of his men, or even an accident in the heat of confrontation. But until I know the truth, I can't move forward." "Is that why you saved me at the bridge? To get close to my father and learn the truth?" Hank's eyes flashed. "Is that what you think? That I engineered a bridge collapse and just happened to be in the right place to save Francisco Valentino's daughter? Put that way, it did sound absurd." "No," Grace admitted, "but the coincidence is remarkable." "Life is full of remarkable coincidences," Hank said. "I was on my way to town to register my deed. I took the high trail because it has better views, and I wanted to reacquaint myself with the land. I saw a woman approaching a bridge that looked ready to collapse, and I moved to warn her. When it gave way, I reacted. There was no calculation, no plan." The sincerity in his voice was convincing, but Grace wasn't ready to let it go. "And agreeing to work on the bridge project for my father, is that also without calculation?" "That decision had multiple reasons," Hank acknowledged. "The pay is good and I need money to rebuild this place. The work uses skills I have. And yes, being around your father and his men might help me learn what really happened 12 years ago." His honesty was disarming. "At least you admit it," Grace said. "I'm not a liar, Grace. Never have been." Hank's gaze was steady. "I've done things I'm not proud of over the years, but deception isn't my way." Something in his directness made Grace believe him, despite her father's warnings. "What will you do if you discover my father was responsible for your father's death?" Hank was silent for a long moment. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "For years I dreamed of revenge, of making him pay, but time changes a person. What matters most to me now is the truth. After that, I'll decide." Grace nodded, appreciating his honesty even if the answer wasn't entirely reassuring. "My father is a good man," she said softly. "Whatever happened that day, I can't believe he would deliberately murder someone, especially a former friend." "Good men can do terrible things when pushed," Hank replied. "But I'm not here to judge before I know the facts." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in thought. Finally, Grace asked, "What was your father like?" A sad smile touched Hank's lips. "Stubborn as a mule, proud." quick to laugh, quick to anger. He worked from sunrise to sunset building this place from nothing. He loved this land maybe too much. And your mother died when I was 8. Influenza. Hank's expression grew distant. After that, it was just Pa and me. He never remarried, threw himself into the ranch instead. I'm sorry, Grace said, understanding the loss all too well. Life in the territories isn't easy, Hank said with a shrug. Everyone carries their share of sorrow. Grace glanced out the window, suddenly aware of how long she'd been away from the broken V. I should head back before my father sends out a search party. Hank nodded, rising from his seat. I'll escort you to the boundary of your father's land. Wouldn't want you running into trouble. As they rode side by side, Grace found herself studying Hank's profile. Despite everything her father had told her, despite the unresolved questions surrounding his return, she couldn't deny her growing attraction to him. There was a strength and honesty about him that drew her in, even as her common sense warned her to keep her distance. At the boundary marked by the weathered sign, Hank rained thunder to a halt. This is as far as I go, Miss Valentino. Your father's men patrol these parts, and I'd rather not explain my presence to them just yet. Will you come to the ranch soon to discuss the bridge project? Grace asked, reluctant to part. Day after tomorrow, Hank confirmed. Your father and I agreed to meet then, once I've had time to review the lumber quotes. Grace nodded. Thank you for answering my questions, even the difficult ones. Thank you for having the courage to ask them, Hank replied. Not many would ride out alone to confront a man with my reputation. Perhaps I'm not as refined as my aunt hoped, Grace said with a small smile. Hank's eyes crinkled at the corners. Perhaps that's not a bad thing. With a final nod, he turned Thunder and rode back toward his property. Grace watched him go, a mixture of emotions swirling within her. Whatever the truth about the past, she was beginning to believe that Hank Blackwell was a man of integrity, regardless of what others might say. As she rode back to the broken V, Grace rehearsed what she would tell her father. The truth that she'd visited Hank would only worry him, yet she was reluctant to lie outright. In the end, she decided on a version of the truth. She'd ridden further than intended and had stopped for water at a small stream, losing track of time. Francisco seemed to accept this explanation, though his reminder to stay closer to home in the future carried a hint of suspicion. Grace felt a twinge of guilt but pushed it aside. She was 20 years old, no longer a child to be sheltered from difficult truths. The next day passed slowly, with Grace helping Maria with household tasks and spending time with her father reviewing the ranch's accounts. Though she'd never admitted it to her aunt, Grace had a good head for figures and had always enjoyed this aspect of ranch management. You remember more than I expected, Francisco commented as they finished reviewing the cattle sales for the spring. Just because Aunt Margaret tried to turn me into a lady doesn't mean I forgot everything you taught me, Grace replied. Francisco smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become, Gracie. She always said you had more sense than 20 ordinary girls put together. I miss her, Grace said softly, even after all these years. So do I every day. Francisco closed the ledger. She would have known how to handle this situation with Blackwell. What would she have done? Grace asked, curious. Francisco considered the question. Carmela believed in facing problems directly. She would have invited Blackwell to dinner, served him your mother's best enchiladas, and asked him plainly what his intentions were. Perhaps we should take her approach, Grace suggested. Invite him to dinner when he comes tomorrow. Francisco looked skeptical. Your mother could charm a rattlesnake into dancing. I don't have her gift for diplomacy. But I'm her daughter, Grace pointed out. Maybe I inherited some of that charm. Her father studied her for a moment. You want to help Blackwell find his answers, don't you? I want the truth, Papa, Grace replied honestly. For everyone's sake. Isn't 12 years of shadow enough? Francisco sighed deeply. Perhaps it is. Very well, we'll invite him to dinner tomorrow. But Gracie, his expression grew serious, be careful of your heart. Hank Blackwell may seem honorable, but his primary loyalty will always be to his father's memory. I'll be careful, Grace promised, though she wondered if it was already too late for such caution. The cowboy who had caught her as she fell had already begun to catch her heart as well. The following day, Grace found herself spending more time than usual on her appearance before Hank's expected arrival. She chose a dress of deep blue that her mother had always said brought out the amber flecks in her brown eyes, and arranged her dark hair in a simple but flattering style. "You look beautiful, Mija," Maria commented as Grace entered the kitchen to help with dinner preparations. "Like your mother on the day she first met your father." Grace blushed. "I just want to look presentable for a guest." Maria's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. "The enchiladas are your mother's recipe. If this Blackwell boy has any sense, he will appreciate them." "He's hardly a boy, Maria," Grace pointed out. "He must be at least 27. To an old woman like me, anyone under 30 is a boy," Maria replied with a shrug. "But you are right, he is a man. A handsome one, no. With those eyes like storm clouds." Grace's blush deepened. "I hadn't noticed." Maria's laugh was warm and knowing. "Of course not, Mija. That is why you wear the blue dress and spend an hour on your hair." Before Grace could formulate a response, Miguel appeared at the kitchen door. "Rider coming," he announced. "It's Blackwell." Grace's pulse quickened as she moved to the window. Sure enough, Hank was approaching on Thunder, his figure straight and proud in the saddle. He wore a clean shirt and his best denim, she noticed, and had trimmed his stubble to a neat shadow along his jaw. "I'll tell Papa," she said, smoothing her skirts before heading to her father's study. Francisco emerged onto the porch just as Hank dismounted. Grace watched from the doorway as the two men greeted each other with cautious formality. "Mr. Blackwell," Francisco said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." "Mr. Valentino," Hank replied, shaking the offered hand. "I've reviewed the lumber quotes. The price is fair, especially with the volume discount for the quantity we'll need." "Good, good. We can discuss the details inside." Francisco gestured toward the house, then noticed Grace in the doorway. "Ah, you remember my daughter, of course." Hank removed his hat, revealing hair still damp from a recent washing. "Miss Valentino," he said with a nod. "Good to see you again." "Mr. Blackwell," Grace replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than it felt. "We hope you'll join us for dinner after your business with my father is concluded." Hank glanced at Francisco, a question in his eyes. "Please do," Francisco confirmed, though Grace could hear the slight reluctance in his tone. "Maria has prepared quite a feast." "In that case, I'd be honored," Hank accepted. The business discussion took place in Francisco's study, with Grace excusing herself to help Maria with the final dinner preparations. When the men emerged an hour later, they seemed to have reached an amicable agreement about the bridge project. "We'll begin next Monday," Francisco announced as they moved to the dining room. "Mr. Blackwell has some excellent ideas about improving the design to prevent future collapses." "I've seen a few bridges in my travels," Hank said modestly, "including some that shouldn't have been standing at all." "Like the one I was crossing," Grace noted. "Exactly like that one," Hank agreed, his eyes meeting hers with warmth that made her heart skip. Dinner was a surprisingly pleasant affair. Maria's enchiladas were indeed excellent, and Francisco opened a bottle of good Spanish wine to accompany the meal. After initial awkwardness, the conversation flowed more easily than Grace had expected, with Hank sharing stories of his travels and Francisco discussing changes to the territory over the years. "Nogales has grown considerably since the railroad came through," Francisco explained. "Land values have doubled in just a few years." "I noticed," Hank said, The town's barely recognizable from what I remember. Progress comes whether we want it or not, Francisco commented. Soon they'll be talking about statehood again. You think it will happen this time? Grace asked. Eventually, her father replied. Though whether in our lifetime remains to be seen. The politicians in Washington have their own priorities, and they rarely include the concerns of those of us actually living in the territories, Hank added. Francisco nodded in agreement, and Grace was struck by this moment of accord between the two men. Perhaps there was hope for reconciliation after all. After dinner, Francisco suggested they move to the veranda for coffee. The evening was pleasantly cool, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Maria brought out a tray with coffee and her special cinnamon cookies, then discreetly withdrew. As they sipped their coffee, a comfortable silence fell. Grace found herself watching Hank covertly, admiring the way the lamplight from the window played across his features. He seemed more relaxed than she'd yet seen him, as if the good food and company had temporarily eased some of his burden. Mr. Blackwell, Francisco said suddenly, breaking the silence, my daughter believes it's time we spoke openly about the past. Hank's posture stiffened slightly, but his expression remained calm. I'd welcome that, sir. Francisco set down his cup. You came back for answers about your father's death. I understand that, but I'm not sure I have the answers you seek. You were there that day, Hank said, his voice level. That's more than I can say. Yes, I was there. Francisco sighed heavily. Your father came to my property armed and angry. He accused me of stealing his water, of deliberately trying to ruin him. He threatened to destroy the small dam we'd built. And then, Hank prompted when Francisco paused, there was a confrontation. Words were exchanged, then shouting. Your father drew his gun. My men reacted. Several shots were fired almost simultaneously. Francisco met Hank's gaze directly. I honestly don't know whose bullet struck your father. It could have been mine, Davis's, or any of 3 other men who were present. Or it could have been deliberate, Hank suggested quietly. I won't deny the possibility, Francisco conceded. There was bad blood by then, and your father had made threats before, but I give you my word, I never ordered anyone to harm Jedediah. Grace watched Hank carefully, seeing the conflict in his eyes, the desire to believe fighting against years of suspicion. Why did you let me leave afterward? Hank asked. A 15-year-old boy, alone. Francisco looked genuinely surprised by the question. Let you? Hank, we searched for days after you disappeared. I was worried sick about you, regardless of what had happened with your father. I never knew that, Hank said slowly. Where did you go? Grace asked gently. Hank's gaze shifted to her. North at first. Found work with a cattle outfit heading to Montana. Lied about my age, worked twice as hard as any man there to prove my worth. After that, wherever the work took me. It couldn't have been easy, Grace said, her heart aching for the boy he had been. It wasn't, Hank acknowledged. But it made me who I am. Francisco leaned forward. Hank, I can't change what happened to your father, but I can tell you that his death has weighed on me all these years. Not knowing who fired the fatal shot, not knowing what happened to his son. These things have been my burden. As not knowing the truth has been mine, Hank replied. Perhaps we can help each other find peace, Francisco suggested. Work together on this bridge project, rebuild what was broken, not just the crossing, but the trust between our families. It was an olive branch, offered sincerely, and Grace held her breath as she waited for Hank's response. After a long moment, Hank nodded. I'd like that, sir. I've carried my anger long enough. The tension that had hung between them since Hank's return seemed to ease, if not disappear entirely. It was a beginning, Grace thought. A foundation on which something new might be built. As the evening drew to a close, Francisco excused himself, leaving Grace and Hank alone on the veranda. The night had deepened, A blanket of stars spread across the sky and a crescent moon casting silver light across the landscape. "Your father surprised me tonight," Hank admitted quietly. "I didn't expect such honesty." "Papa is many things, but he's not a liar," Grace said. "Whatever happened with your father, he's carried the weight of it all these years." Hank nodded slowly. "I believe him. About searching for me, at least. That changes things." "How so?" "I've spent 12 years believing everyone here was glad to see the last Blackwell gone," Hank explained. "Knowing someone looked for me, worried about me. It matters." Grace moved closer to him, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "What will you do now?" "Continue with the bridge project. Rebuild my father's ranch. Try to find more answers about what happened that day." Hank turned to face her. "And perhaps explore whatever this is between us." Grace's breath caught. "What do you think this is?" "I'm not sure," Hank admitted. "But I know that from the moment I caught you on that bridge, something changed for me. Something I wasn't looking for and certainly didn't expect." "For me too," Grace confessed softly. Hank's hand rose to gently touch her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly soft against her skin. "Your father would probably shoot me if he saw this," he murmured. "Probably," Grace agreed with a small smile, "but I'd nurse you back to health." Hank's low chuckle warmed her more than the evening air. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "It's a long ride back to my place." "Will I see you tomorrow?" Grace asked. "I need to go to town for more supplies, but I could stop by on my way back," Hank offered. "I'd like that." Hank hesitated, then leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Good night, Grace Valentino." "Good night, Hank Blackwell," she whispered. As she watched him ride away into the moonlit night, Grace felt as though she stood on the threshold of something momentous. Like the moment on the bridge when everything had hung in the balance, she now felt suspended between what had been and what might be. Whatever came next, she knew with certainty that her life had irrevocably changed the day the bridge collapsed, and a cowboy caught her before she fell. The following week passed in a flurry of activity as preparations for the bridge project began in earnest. Lumber and other materials arrived from Nogales, and Francisco assembled a crew of workers, with Hank overseeing the operation. Grace found herself riding out to the canyon frequently, ostensibly bringing food and water to the workers, but primarily seeking Hank's company. The changes in him were subtle but noticeable. The hard edge of suspicion had softened somewhat, though he maintained a certain reserve around Francisco and the ranch hands. With Grace, however, he gradually let his guard down, revealing a dry wit and thoughtful nature that drew her to him even more. Their moments alone were brief but precious, a shared glance across the worksite, a few minutes of quiet conversation while the workers ate their midday meal, an occasional brush of hands as she passed him a canteen. Each interaction strengthened the connection between them, a connection they both knew was growing into something deeper. 2 weeks into the project, with the bridge's foundation posts firmly set on both sides of the canyon, Hank invited Grace to visit the Blackwell Ranch again. "I've made some improvements," he told her as they stood at the edge of the worksite, far enough from the others to speak privately. "I'd like you to see it." "I'd love to," Grace replied, "but Papa is still wary. He wouldn't approve of me visiting your property alone." Hank considered this. "Bring Maria as chaperone," he suggested. "Even your father couldn't object to that," Grace nodded. "I'll ask him tonight." To her surprise, Francisco agreed with minimal resistance. "Maria must accompany you at all times," he insisted, "and be back before sunset." "Of course, Papa," Grace promised, kissing his cheek. "Thank you for understanding." The next afternoon, Grace and Maria set out for the Blackwell Ranch. As they approached, Grace was struck by the transformation that had taken place in just a few weeks. The broken windows had been replaced, the porch mended, and the roof repaired. A fresh coat of whitewash brightened the house's exterior, and the yard had been cleared of weeds and debris. Hank emerged from the barn as they rode up, his face lighting with a smile that made Grace's heart flutter. "Welcome to Blackwell Ranch," he called, approaching to help her dismount. "It looks wonderful," Grace said honestly. "You've worked miracles in such a short time." "Still plenty to do," Hank replied, helping Maria down from her horse, "but it's starting to feel like home again." He led them inside, where the changes were even more dramatic. The main room now contained proper furniture, a sofa, 2 comfortable chairs, and a polished wooden table. A bookshelf held a small collection of volumes, and colorful woven rugs covered portions of the wooden floor. "Where did you get all this?" Grace asked, running her hand over the back of a chair. "Most of it was still here, just stored in the barn or the root cellar," Hank explained. "My father built most of the furniture himself. The rest I purchased in town." "It's lovely," Grace said, genuinely impressed. Maria sniffed, looking around with critical eyes. "It needs a woman's touch," she pronounced. "But the bones are good." Hank laughed. "High praise indeed coming from you, Maria." The housekeeper's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I will inspect the kitchen," she announced, moving toward the back of the house with determined steps. Left momentarily alone, Grace and Hank shared a smile. "She's warming to you," Grace observed. "Slowly," Hank agreed. "Very slowly." He showed Grace the rest of the house, the small study with its desk and map of the territory, pinned to the wall, the 2 bedrooms upstairs that he'd recently finished painting, and finally the kitchen where Maria was examining the stove with professional interest. "It's a good stove," she grudgingly admitted. "But your pantry is shameful. How does a man live with so little food?" "I eat at the worksite most days," Hank explained, "but I'm working on stocking up." "HMPH," was Maria's only response. After the house tour, Hank showed them the improvements to the barn and corrals. Thunder now had company. 2 additional horses and a milk cow occupied the stalls. "Building up slowly," Hank said. "I've arranged to purchase a small herd of cattle next month." "Nothing like your father's operation, but enough to get started." "You've accomplished so much already," Grace said admiringly. "Having a purpose helps," Hank replied. "For years I worked other men's land, built other men's dreams. Now I'm building my own." The pride in his voice touched Grace deeply. Despite everything that had happened, despite the lingering questions about his father's death, Hank had found the strength to return and reclaim his heritage. When it was time to leave, Hank walked them to their horses. Maria mounted first, then deliberately rode a short distance away, giving them a moment of semi-privacy while still maintaining her role as chaperone. "Thank you for coming," Hank said, his voice low. "It matters to me that you see what I'm trying to build here." "I'm glad I came," Grace replied. "What you've done is impressive, Hank." He helped her mount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "The bridge should be finished within 2 weeks," he told her. "After that, I won't have a reason to visit the broken V every day." "Perhaps you'll need to find other reasons," Grace suggested boldly. Hank's smile was slow and warm. "Perhaps I will." As they rode away, Grace glanced back to see Hank watching them go, his tall figure silhouetted against the white house. Something about the image stayed with her, a man reclaiming his place in the world, putting down roots after years of drifting. A man building a future she increasingly hoped might include her. The bridge project progressed steadily, with only minor setbacks from occasional rain showers. Hank proved to be a skilled foreman, earning the respect of the workers with his willingness to tackle the hardest tasks himself and his fair treatment of everyone, regardless of background. Even Sheriff Davis, who still regarded Hank with suspicion, had to acknowledge the quality of the work. "Bridge is coming along nicely," he commented during one of his frequent visits to the site. "Might even last longer than the old one." "That's the plan," Hank replied evenly. "This one's built to last generations, not just years." Grace, who was delivering lunch to the workers, didn't miss the metaphor. Hank wasn't just building a bridge across a canyon. He was building bridges between past and present, between the Blackwells and the Valentinos, between himself and the community that had once rejected him. As the project neared completion, an unexpected visitor arrived at the broken V. Grace was helping Maria in the garden when the sound of approaching hooves drew her attention. A well-dressed older woman on a fine bay mare rode up to the house, accompanied by a young man who was clearly her escort. "May I help you?" Grace called, setting down her basket of harvested vegetables and wiping her hands on her apron. The woman reined her horse to a stop, examining Grace with open curiosity. "You must be Francisco's daughter," she said. "I'm Eleanor Parker. Your father and I have business matters to discuss." Grace recognized the name. Eleanor Parker owned the largest mercantile in Nogales and had significant investments throughout the territory. "Of course, Mrs. Parker. Please come inside. I'll send for my father." As she showed the visitors into the parlor, Grace was struck by Mrs. Parker's commanding presence. Though in her 60s, the woman carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to respect. Her clothing was expensive but practical, and sharp blue eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the room. "Your father has done well for himself," Mrs. Parker observed. "When I first met Francisco 20 years ago, he was just starting to build this place. Now the Broken V is one of the finest ranches in the territory." "He's worked hard," Grace agreed, pouring tea for their guests while Miguel went to fetch Francisco from the south pasture. "Hard work and good fortune," Mrs. Parker nodded, "both necessary for success in this country." When Francisco arrived, he greeted Mrs. Parker warmly. "Eleanor, what a pleasant surprise. What brings you out to the Broken V?" "Business and curiosity," Mrs. Parker replied. "I heard about your bridge project and about who's running it." Francisco's expression tightened slightly. "Ah. News travels fast. Small towns," Mrs. Parker shrugged. "Is it true then? Jedediah Blackwell's boy is back." "Hank returned a few weeks ago," Francisco confirmed. "He's overseeing the bridge construction." Mrs. Parker's eyebrows rose. "Interesting choice given your history." "Hank saved my daughter's life when the old bridge collapsed," Francisco explained. "Whatever happened in the past, I owed him that much." Mrs. Parker turned her shrewd gaze to Grace. "Is that so? Well, young lady, it seems you've brought about quite a change in circumstances." Grace felt herself blush under the woman's penetrating stare. "Mr. Blackwell happened to be in the right place at the right time," she said modestly. Mrs. Parker didn't look convinced. "And now he's rebuilding his father's ranch, I hear." "He is," Francisco confirmed. "Doing a fine job of it, too, from what I've seen." "You've visited the Blackwell place?" Mrs. Parker seemed surprised. "No, but my daughter has, with our housekeeper as chaperone," Francisco replied. "And Hank has described his progress." Mrs. Parker's eyes darted between Grace and her father, a knowing look crossing her features. "I see," she said, though what exactly she saw remained unspoken. The conversation then turned to business matters: cattle prices, railroad shipping rates, and the territory's economic prospects. Grace served refreshments and participated when asked, but mostly observed the interaction between her father and the formidable Mrs. Parker. As the visitors prepared to leave, Mrs. Parker took Grace aside. "My dear, may I offer some advice?" "Of course," Grace replied, somewhat surprised. "I knew both your father and Jedediah Blackwell when they were young men building their dreams," Mrs. Parker said quietly. "They were more alike than either would ever admit: stubborn, proud, determined. When water became scarce and tensions rose, neither would bend." "You believe the feud was preventable?" Grace asked. "Most tragedies are, with hindsight," Mrs. Parker sighed. "But that's in the past. What interests me is the future. I see the way your eyes light up when Hank Blackwell's name is mentioned." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Mrs. Parker, no need to explain, child. The heart wants what it wants. The older woman patted Grace's hand. Just tread carefully. Old wounds can reopen easily, and not everyone in Nogales will welcome a union between a Valentino and a Blackwell. You're getting rather ahead of things, Grace protested weakly. Mrs. Parker's smile was knowing. Perhaps, but I've lived long enough to recognize the signs. Just remember that love requires courage, especially when it crosses boundaries others have established. With that enigmatic advice, Mrs. Parker departed, leaving Grace thoughtful. Until that moment, she hadn't allowed herself to fully acknowledge the depth of her feelings for Hank. But Mrs. Parker's words forced her to confront the truth. She was falling in love with Hank Blackwell. Perhaps had been since the moment he caught her at the bridge. That evening, as she sat on the veranda watching the sunset, Francisco joined her. Eleanor Parker is a perceptive woman, he commented, settling into the chair beside her. She rarely misses anything, especially matters of the heart. Grace glanced at her father. What do you mean? She mentioned her concern that you might be developing feelings for young Blackwell, Francisco said carefully. She wanted to ensure I wouldn't stand in your way if that were the case. And what did you tell her? Grace asked, her heart beating faster. Francisco was silent for a long moment. I told her that my daughter is old enough to make her own choices, but young enough that I worry about her judgment sometimes. Papa, he held up a hand. Let me finish, Gracie. I also told her that Hank Blackwell has proven himself to be a man of integrity, despite my initial misgivings. That he saved my daughter's life, and for that alone, I would give him a fair chance. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. Do you mean that? I do, Francisco sighed. The past has cast long shadows over both our families. Perhaps it's time to step into the light. She leaned over to hug him tightly. Thank you, Papa. Don't thank me yet, Francisco warned. If Blackwell breaks your heart, I'll still have to shoot him. Grace laughed through her tears. I'll be sure to warn him. 2 days later, the bridge was completed. It stood strong and solid across the canyon, its design both practical and elegantly simple. A small celebration was held at the worksite, with Francisco providing food and drink for all the workers who had contributed to the project. As the festivities wound down and the workers dispersed, Grace found herself standing with Hank at the center of the new bridge, looking down at the canyon below. Hard to believe it was just a month ago that I nearly fell to my death here, she remarked. One of the more fortunate near disasters of my life, Hank replied with a smile. Only one. Well, there was the time in Wyoming when I nearly rode off a cliff in a blizzard, Hank said, and the stampede in Kansas that came within inches of trampling me. You've lived dangerously, Grace observed. I have, Hank acknowledged, but never with much purpose until now. The setting sun bathed the canyon in golden light, creating long shadows that stretched across the new wooden planks beneath their feet. What happens now? Grace asked quietly. The bridge is finished. Now I focus on rebuilding the ranch, Hank replied. There's still much to do before winter. And us? Grace's heart pounded as she asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. Hank turned to face her fully. Grace, I came back to Nogales for answers about my father. I never expected to find someone who would make me want to stay regardless of those answers. And have you? She asked. Found answers, I mean. Some, Hank said. Enough to know that holding on to anger serves no purpose. Enough to believe your father when he says he didn't intend for my father to die that day. And is that enough? It has to be, Hank said simply. The past can't be changed, but the future, that's still unwritten. He reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. I don't have much to offer you, Grace. A half-rebuilt ranch, a complicated history with your family, a man who spent more time drifting than putting down roots. You offer yourself, Grace replied softly. That's enough for me. Hank's free hand came up to cup her cheek. Your father might disagree. "He's coming around," Grace assured him. "Mrs. Parker had a talk with him." Hank looked surprised. "Eleanor Parker, the merchant she visited yesterday," Grace explained. "She seems to think we make a good match." "Smart woman," Hank murmured, leaning closer. The first touch of his lips on hers was gentle, tentative, as if he expected her to pull away. When she didn't, his kiss deepened, his arms sliding around her waist to draw her closer. Grace responded with all the feelings she'd kept contained for weeks, her arms winding around his neck. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. "We should head back," Hank said reluctantly, "before your father sends out a search party. Or comes looking himself with his shotgun," Grace added with a small laugh. They walked hand in hand across the bridge that had brought them together, each step carrying them away from the past and toward a future neither had imagined a month ago. Francisco was waiting on the porch when they returned to the Broken V. His expression was unreadable as he watched them approach. "Bridge is holding up well," he commented as they reached the steps. "It'll outlast us all," Hank replied, his voice steady despite the tension Grace could feel in him. Francisco nodded, then cleared his throat. "Maria has prepared dinner. There's plenty if you'd care to join us, Hank." The use of his first name wasn't lost on either of them. It was a small gesture but significant. "I'd be honored," Hank accepted. During dinner, Francisco surprised them both by raising the subject of the Blackwell Ranch. "How many head of cattle are you planning to start with?" he asked. 20 to begin with," Hank replied, building up slowly. Francisco nodded thoughtfully. "Smart approach." The drought affected the southern pastures more than the northern ones. "Your father's your land has good water access now. The creek has recovered well," Hank agreed cautiously. "I've been thinking," Francisco continued. "The Broken V has more cattle than we can efficiently manage with our current grazing rotation. I might be interested in leasing some of your northern pasture if you're amenable." Hank set down his fork, clearly surprised by the offer. "That's generous." "It's practical," Francisco corrected. "Good business for us both." Grace looked between the two men, understanding the significance of what her father was proposing, not just a business arrangement, but a partnership that acknowledged Hank's rightful place in the community. "I'd need to think about the details," Hank said carefully. "But in principle, yes, I'm interested." "Good," Francisco nodded. "We can discuss terms when you're ready." The rest of the meal passed pleasantly, with a new ease in the conversation. When it was time for Hank to leave, Francisco surprised them again. "It's getting late," he observed. "The guest room is still made up if you'd prefer to stay the night and ride out in the morning." Hank hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, that would be best." As Francisco excused himself to his study, Hank and Grace moved to the veranda, where the night air was cool and fragrant with the scent of sage. "Your father continues to surprise me," Hank admitted. "He's trying," Grace said. "For my sake, and perhaps for his own peace of mind as well." They stood close together, not quite touching but acutely aware of each other's presence. "I never expected this," Hank murmured. "Any of it. Coming back the bridge you—" "Sometimes life takes unexpected turns," Grace replied, "like bridges collapsing." Hank smiled, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm glad I was there to catch you." "So am I," Grace whispered. In the weeks that followed, a new pattern emerged. Hank divided his time between rebuilding his ranch and helping with projects at the Broken V. Francisco and he developed a cautious working relationship that gradually evolved into something approaching friendship. The past wasn't forgotten, but it no longer stood as an insurmountable barrier between them. Grace found herself falling more deeply in love with Hank each day. She loved his quiet strength, his integrity, the way he approached every task with careful deliberation. She loved his rare but wonderful laugh, the gentleness in his hands when he helped her mount her horse, the thoughtful questions he asked about her time in Philadelphia. And Hank made no secret of his feelings for her. Though still reserved by nature, he found small ways to show his affection, bringing her wildflowers he'd found while riding, carving a delicate wooden box for her hairpins, teaching her to shoot with his father's old rifle. By the time autumn began to fade toward winter, their attachment was common knowledge in Nogales. Most accepted it with good grace, particularly after seeing how the relationship had healed old divisions. Even Sheriff Davis had grudgingly acknowledged that Hank Blackwell's return had brought positive changes to the community. "Never thought I'd see the day," Davis commented to Francisco after church one Sunday. "A Valentino and a Blackwell working together instead of at odds. Times do change." "People change," Francisco corrected, "if they're given the chance." As Christmas approached, Hank completed enough renovations on his house to host a small gathering. He invited Francisco, Grace, Maria, and a few others from the community, including Alina Parker, who had become something of a champion for the young couple. The night of the party, snow fell gently across the landscape, unusual for Nogales but creating a perfect holiday atmosphere. The Blackwell ranch house glowed with lamplight and the warmth of a crackling fire. Evergreen boughs decorated the mantel, and candles shone from each window. Grace arrived with her father and Maria, her heart full at the sight of the home Hank had rebuilt with such care. Inside, the transformation was complete. What had once been a neglected shell was now a welcoming home, filled with good food, music from a borrowed fiddle, and the laughter of friends. "You've worked miracles here," she told Hank as he showed her the final touches: curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the sofa, shelves filled with books. "I had good motivation," he replied, his eyes warm as they met hers. Later, as the party continued inside, Hank drew Grace onto the porch. Snow continued to fall, dusting her hair and eyelashes with delicate flakes that caught the light from the windows. "I have something for you," Hank said, reaching into his pocket. "An early Christmas gift." He withdrew a small object and placed it in her palm. It was a carved wooden heart, polished to a soft sheen with their initials entwined on one side. "It's beautiful," Grace breathed, running her finger over the smooth surface. "There's more," Hank said quietly. From his other pocket, he produced a small velvet box. Grace's heart began to race as he opened it, revealing a simple gold ring with a small diamond. "It was my mother's," Hank explained, his voice husky with emotion. "One of the few things I took with me when I left 12 years ago. I always planned to give it to my wife someday if I was fortunate enough to find someone who could love a drifter like me." "Hank," Grace whispered, tears filling her eyes. He took her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "Grace Valentino, you've given me back my home, my purpose, and my heart. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Grace answered without hesitation. "Yes, with all my heart." Hank slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and promise of their future together. When they returned inside, flushed and smiling, Francisco took one look at his daughter's radiant face and the ring on her finger and nodded, as if confirming something he'd long expected. "I believe congratulations are in order," he announced to the gathering. "It seems my daughter has agreed to become Mrs. Blackwell." A cheer went up from the guests, with Alina Parker looking particularly satisfied. Maria wiped tears from her eyes, and even Sheriff Davis offered a grudging smile and handshake to Hank. As midnight approached and guests began to depart, Francisco drew Hank aside. "I have something for you," he said, producing an envelope from his coat. "Consider it an early wedding gift." Hank opened it, his expression changing to one of shock as he read the contents. "This is the water rights agreement for both properties. You're signing over equal access. It should have been that way from the start," Francisco said quietly. Perhaps if it had been, things would have turned out differently for our families. "Thank you," Hank said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more than I can say." "Just promise me you'll take care of my daughter," Francisco replied. "She's all I have left, with my life," Hank vowed. "Always." Grace and Hank were married the following spring, when wildflowers carpeted the hills and the creek ran full and clear between their properties. The ceremony took place on the new bridge, symbolizing the connection between their families and their shared future. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which lasted well into the night. Eleanor Parker declared it the finest wedding Nogales had seen in 20 years, and even the territorial governor, passing through on his way to Tucson, stopped to offer his congratulations. As the sun set on their wedding day, Hank led Grace across the bridge to a waiting carriage that would take them to Tucson for a brief honeymoon. "Happy, Mrs. Blackwell?" he asked, his arm secure around her waist. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Though I still can't believe how much has changed in less than a year. All because a bridge collapsed and a cowboy happened to be riding by," Hank mused. "Not just any cowboy," Grace corrected, reaching up to touch his face. "The right one." As their carriage pulled away, Grace looked back at the bridge illuminated in the golden light of sunset. What had once been a site of near tragedy had become the foundation of their future together, a symbol of strength, connection, and love that would endure long after they were gone. And in the years that followed, the story of the bridge collapse and the cowboy who saved the Valentino girl became legend in Nogales. Children and grandchildren would gather around fires on winter nights to hear how a moment of disaster had led to healing between families, how love had bridged a canyon of bitterness, and how Grace Valentino and Hank Blackwell had built a legacy of reconciliation that transformed not just their lives but the entire community. Their first child, a son they named Michael Francisco Blackwell, was born the following winter, with Eleanor Parker standing proudly as godmother. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Carmela Eleanor Blackwell, named for both grandmothers. The Blackwell and Valentino ranches prospered under their joint management, eventually merging into one of the largest and most successful operations in the territory. When Arizona finally achieved statehood in 1912, Hank served on the first state legislature, advocating for the rights of ranchers and farmers throughout the new state. Through it all, the bridge remained strong, a testament to what could be built when people chose connection over division, love over hatred, and the promise of the future over the pain of the past. And on quiet evenings, long after their children were grown with families of their own, Grace and Hank would sometimes walk hand in hand to the middle of that bridge, remembering the moment when she fell, and he caught her the moment when both their lives changed forever. "Best catch I ever made," Hank would always say, gathering her close. "And the only fall I never regretted," Grace would reply, standing on tiptoe to kiss the man who had saved her in more ways than one. Together they built a love as enduring as the bridge itself, a love that began with a moment of crisis, but sustained them through all the joys and sorrows of a lifetime shared. A love that proved some connections, once forged, could never truly be broken.